This is going to be a multilingual, a bilingual conversation between Angela and Francia. So I'm going to be here really to just help facilitate this conversation between them. And we're going to start out, as I mentioned in the introduction to Angela Davis, right into the work that Professor Davis has been doing internationally and in the United States specifically. And so, as I mentioned in the bio, Angela Davis is one of the most vocal prison abolitionists, raising consciousness about the wide-ranging effects of the carceral state, especially on the lives of Black people, queer people, trans people. So, Professor Davis, could you say more about what abolition looks like, what it might look like in practice, and how the abolition movement, what relationship the abolition movement in the US and struggles against anti-Black state violence in other places you have visited and you have organized in can have, what are the connections, what are the relationships between these movements? It's a loaded question.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say what an honor it is to have been invited to participate in this conversation with Francia Márquez. I first met Francia in 2010. I can't believe it's been so long. You were very young then, Francia. And I visited her village in La Toma in 2010, the same year, as she was leading the movement to prevent the eviction of her community by the government, as the government was capitulating to the demands of the mining company, Anglo Gold Ashanti, that wanted to literally strip mine her village and the surrounding areas for gold. I have never been so impressed to witness the work of a community leader as I was watching Francia and witnessing her important work. And Francia, time and time again, I return to those memories that have inspired me in so many ways. So when I learned about her candidacy for the presidency of Colombia, I was so overjoyed. Hooray for Francia, but also for Black Colombians and indigenous Colombians and poor Colombians and for Black women all over Latin America and the world. So first of all, I want to say congratulations to Francia, and I want you to know that I offer you eternal love and solidarity. And just a note of thanks to Tiana Paschal, who facilitated the first encounter between us and many thereafter. And also thank you, Mamira Prosper, for facilitating. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Okay, for facilitating this conversation. And of course, the People's Forum for sponsoring the event. Now, when it comes to abolition, I would say that abolition is a practice that is informed by an analysis of state violence, an analysis that recognizes the structural character of racism that emanates from the lasting effects of colonialism and the slave trade. Abolition is a practice. And of course, when we say abolition, we're referring very specifically to the abolition of institutions of state violence, the police, prisons, etc. And it is a practice that I think is most effective and most powerful when its feminist dimension is at the fore. That is to say, we need to recognize the what some might call the intersectionalities of state violence and intimate violence. And that we strive not only to dismantle the specific institutions of state violence, but rather our perspective is one that acknowledges that we can't simply focus on prisons and police structures. We have to look at the larger picture. We have to ask larger questions. And perhaps the most capacious of those questions is, what would our societies have to look like in order not to rely on state violence and intimate violence? So these larger questions also move beyond national frameworks. Even though here in the U.S. We have a particular problem that prevents us from imagining ourselves as part of the world. Even radical activists often think about the U.S. as the center of the world. But even here, we can't simply focus on U.S. prisons and U.S. police. We have to talk about the transformation of society, jobs, housing, education, healthcare, etc. And we have to think globally. We want to change the world from Minneapolis, where George Floyd was lynched, and Louisville, where Breonna Taylor was murdered by the police, to Palestine, to Paris, to Rio de Janeiro, and to Bogota. So I don't think that abolition can achieve its goal, which is the re-envisioning of society without its global dimension. And I think I'll stop there. I have a tendency to go on and on, but
we love it. Thank you. And so, Francia, I just wanted to connect the question that I have for you with the conversation that Professor Davis is bringing up. Angela, I'm going to call you all the different names. So the topic of carceral state and racialized state violence has not been at the center of mainstream Colombian politics, but it has been central to the mobilization of Black and Indigenous organizations. So in your own political work, you have been very clear about how state violence is racialized in Colombia. And you have even suggested that this takes the form of hyper incarceration of Black people, dispossession and displacement, and the targeting of Black leaders, especially those defending territorial rights. How are you thinking? What is your thinking around the carceral state, and whether abolition is a kind of useful framework that could be used in Colombia by yourself and other militant activists?
Bueno, primero, muchas gracias por este espacio.
Well, first of all, thank you for this space, and thank you, Angela Davis. It's great to meet you again virtually. I also remember the first time that we met. For me, it was something wonderful. I could not believe that I was going to meet such a strong woman that has done so much for humanity, for the whole world, for justice, for racial justice, for gender justice. And when I got to San Francisco, California, I remember that I told her that we wanted her support because we were about to be uprooted from our communities. And Angela Davis responded that I did not have to ask her for a favor to show her solidarity, because solidarity was part of her life. It's particularly international solidarity had saved her life. And that was a very strong message for me, because I think at that moment, that was the beginning of our struggle in Colombia, which is based on solidarity. So this is a very emotional moment, because my compañero Manuel Marcos Diaz it's been 3 years since his loss. We dreamed together, and we also shared times with Angela Davis, so I keep his memory here in this space. I have to say that the prison system here in Colombia is a continuation of enslavement, of the system of slavery, because the people who are imprisoned, the kind of imprisonment that they go through It is a product of the racialization of their bodies, the racialization of their territories. It is a racialized body that is incarcerated. Afro-descendant, indigenous people, peasant farmers, women, subjects that the capitalist system uses in the categories of exclusion and oppression. And of course, the capitalist system that uses people, the most impoverished, that uses racialized categories of oppression and exclusion, that it throws away people when they cannot use them anymore to die. And people who face this death system that kills people, puts them in prison and takes away their humanity. What we see in the prison population is inhumane conditions. Those people are stripped of their humanity. They're not considered a man, a woman, a social leader, a political leader. They are put in prison and they take away their human condition. And that is what we are living. On March 21st of this year, in the middle of the pandemic, we had here a protest in one of the jails here in Colombia, and the response from the state was warlike against those who were protesting, and they were desperate because of the confinement in prison, which was massive here. And in the middle of the pandemic, they were desperate. They were demanding their rights and safety. And as a result of that, 23 people were killed at the hands of the Colombian state, and over 83 people were injured, imprisoned folks. A few years ago, I attended a national conference, and there was a public official who was very happy because they had built the largest Latin American prison here in Colombia. And at that very moment, I was struggling to pay for my university. I was struggling because to get my professors to allow me to study because I couldn't afford the semester. And I was dumbfounded to see that they were celebrating the largest prison in Latin America, but I never heard them celebrating for the largest university in Latin America that creates opportunities. In that sense, for me, the prison system is a continuation of enslavement, of the system of slavery. And of course, we live this in many ways when we're displaced from our territories, when they threaten us, when they violate our rights, when they consider keeping the armed conflict as a strategy, while impoverished people keep dying, and those who are oppressed all over this country. There's entire communities who are going through a terrible humanitarian crisis. Communities like mine that have made an effort and have said that they want to live in peace. However, this death system based on exploitation, on expropriating not only collective ancestral territories, but also expropriating our human condition, has been imposed and maintains that they have to continue the violence, and armed violence in some way justifies the prison system to fitting into this system of slavery. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Francia, for your remarks. And I think we could probably just have had an entire conversation just on this topic. But in the interest of making sure that we cover and show all the different work that Francia and Angela do, I'm going to move on to different questions, but we can certainly come back to them in the Q&A if we have time for the audience and folks want to dive in a little deeper. Thank you for sharing those answers. So I wanted to shift a little, but again, to connect it, since both of you are bringing up the importance of intersectional analysis. And so this first question is back to you, Angela. And I start out with, quoting U.S. Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet Audre Lorde, who said, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." And in many ways, your work reflects that complexity. And so we're living in this moment where we're seeing a lot more, especially young people who are organizing around climate justice, right? If we think back at the climate summit, and there's a new politics emerging around defunding big oil and gas. And, on what seems to be on another hand, right, leftist movements, especially in Latin America, are engaging in coalition politics, putting Black and Indigenous communities at the center who have developed political agendas that include racial justice, gender justice, among other things. And so for you, Angela, and this is also a question for Francia, and I'll ask one that's a little more specific to Colombia. What is the relationship between these struggles? Like, how do we make these struggles truly be intersectional? And do we think that this kind of intersectional approach can also be transnational, given the multiplicity of today's movements?
Well, first of all, thank you for this question. I'm at home at this moment in Northern California, where our skies are full of smoke, where it's so difficult to breathe, where we're counseled to remain indoors, and it reminds me that. Without a struggle to save this planet, none of our struggles will have meaning. So I don't even think it's a question of choosing to become involved in the effort to save the planet and to turn global warming around. We see at this moment the horrendous impact of racial capitalism and its disdain for the planet, for the plants, for the animals, including the animals that are human. And so I think environmental struggles are so important. And Francia, I remember in 2010 when we were driving down one of the highways near Cali, and we saw huge fields of sugarcane. And we learned that sugarcane is being grown there in order to satisfy the desire of people in the global north to feel that they are contributing to the struggle to save the planet. As a matter of fact, by using a biofuel as opposed to fossil fuels. But at the same time, we learn that these miles and miles of sugarcane, and if I remember correctly, these fields were referred to as the Green Desert. They bore witness to all of the people who had been evicted from that land, people who had actually preserved the integrity of the land and the biodiversity of the land by the things that they grew. And as a consequence of such vast numbers of people being evicted from their land, with nowhere to go, there were these new prisons that were cropping up. And it's very clear that the prisons were designed to hold those people who had been divested of the means with which to sustain themselves. And so this was very clearly a racist move, affecting indigenous people, affecting Afro-descended people. And I mention this because I think it's such a clear example of the ways in which climate issues and environmental issues are ground zero of social justice issues. And I love Audre Lorde's quote, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle. All of these struggles are interrelated. But I think that we are not devoting nearly enough attention to the environment. And this is one of the reasons why I am so proud of the work that Francia has done. And congratulations again for your Goldman Prize, because your work is an indication of the ways in which our global struggles against racism and patriarchy and racial capitalism, homophobia, come together, and they depend on a vibrant struggle to safeguard our environment.
And I'm glad that you made this connection about global North desires and global South extractivism, because the question that I want to pose to Francia really rests in that tension. So in Colombia, as in the rest of the world, climate change has affected Afro-descendant populations disproportionately, and the global North certainly has an ecological debt to the South. Not everybody participates equally in the destruction or ripening or benefiting from these extractivist projects, right, coming out of the earth. So for instance, and Angela, you mentioned it earlier, right, white-owned mining companies coming from the global North. Canada is one of the main culprits, and a lot of times by poisoning the rivers, destroying riverbanks and forests. And oftentimes the populations, as you mentioned, Angela, are dispossessed, evicted, and left to deal with the consequences. And so for you, Francia, I wanted to hear more about your visions for alternatives to capitalism's dependence on the destruction of the earth and the racial disposition of particularly Black and Indigenous populations, right? So, for example, should the global North pay this ecological debt back to these populations of the world? Right? That's just one answer. But what are your visions and your proposals? And I know this is a big question. We could use multiple hours to unpack this, but what are some of the alternatives that you're proposing or that you envision to the dependence of capitalism and the destruction of the earth?
Well,
precisely when I met Angela Davis, we were facing the loss of our land because of the mining, the extractivism that was being proposed in our community, that was proposing to take our ancestral lands that we had occupied since our elders had been enslaved, and that they really fought for them. It was land that they really got after working for years through slavery, and even after slavery. As our elders say, these are lands that they had inherited for the ethnic Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples. Our being as a peoples, as humanity, is not possible without the land, without nature. And we were in that struggle when we met Angela Davis. We were really facing the third largest company for mining worldwide. It was a corporation that has British and Canadian capital throughout the world, in the world that show themselves as developed world, of course, including the United States. And in that moment, the way it was spoken about was development. So you had to sacrifice a community because you had to advance and progress. And who are those communities that have been sacrificed always? Ethnic peoples, Afro-descendant peoples, indigenous peoples, who are considered to not matter. And that struggle, we thought that it was the struggle of La Toma, our community, but it's the struggle that now has to be carried out by the all of humanity in the planet. Because unfortunately, after so many screams, desperate screams from our people who have resisted, who have put forth that we need to introduce a collective vision of the struggles, you need to recognize the collective action as far as the protection of our lands as a living space, not as a space for obtaining more money. And through that struggle, we thought it was something really small, but then we recognized that it was the problem of humanity. And those desperate screams we had in that moment are the desperate screams that so many people are screaming right now because of the effects of the climate crisis. That responsibility, that human responsibility, we not all have the same level of responsibility. The states have a very big responsibility dealing with the crisis that we're facing. The corporations have a lot of responsibility in regards to the climate crisis. Sadly, the consequences and the effects that are also hitting disproportionately those historically impoverished, racialized subjects. It's women who, for example, with the pandemic, we were suffering the consequences disproportionately of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's the people who don't have potable water, who don't have fresh water, who don't have food, access to food, who are really living the consequences. It are the people who have been displaced because of the politics, who have been displaced to really vulnerable places. They're really living the worst consequences of the climate crisis. Of course, sooner than later, this is not just gonna affect the most vulnerable people. If we don't do anything, this is going to affect all of humanity, even though we know there's people doing research to go to another country. But I don't think there's another planet like the one we have. So we need to take on, in the meantime, our responsibility is to continue sharing those ancestral traditional knowledge in the politics. And my decision to run for the presidency is not it's not a desire out of nowhere. It's a feeling of the people. It's a feeling of having responsibility towards nature, to use our a motherly love, to use justice, to use equity, justice, to fight against that politics that is being imposed against life, that politics that puts people, humans, in the center of things, and has forgotten that people are part of nature more broadly. And so facing that in a radical way, and as Black people, we are concrete. When women leave their children, they go out to mobilize against illegal minery. They're radical in their decision to care for their land as a space for life. When in Buenaventura, they go to stop on a port that has led for it's an area where people get caught up like onions, and so people go out to fight against these forces. It's fighting for life and dignity. So these are the paths we're making, and right now we need to birth a politic for life that can stop the climate crisis, that is able to deconstruct that politic of consumption that we are enmeshed in, and that is really ending life in this uterus that we're in.
Thank you. And hopefully during the Q&A portion, Francia, you could go into more about the ancestral knowledge that you speak of. So we're going to continue with our conversation. And I like that, you touched on the fact that Black women were the most affected, right, by the pandemic most recently, but you also talked about Black women being at the center of resistance and struggle. And so the next question I had, and this is for both Angela and Francia, is thinking about the role of Black women, Indigenous women as well, in this new moment of global politics. So, right, that if Black women have been historically one of the main political driving forces of change throughout the Americas, since we're focusing here on Colombia and the US in our conversation, but we're still also seeing that this struggle is criminalized, of course, and Black activists are targeted, assassinated. If we think about the case of Maria Franco in Brazil, Berta Cáceres in Honduras, and then other people whose names we're not citing here, Black and Indigenous women activists in Colombia, for example. So how do you understand the role of Black women in the struggles of today specifically? Rather, if you could take the time to elaborate on some of what you've already touched, and maybe we can start with you, Francia, and then go to Angela.
Well, I think our role as Black women has always been the role of resistance. It's the job of birth. It's a role of birthing justice, equality, and it's been really Black women, Indigenous women, impoverished women who have always had to carry the weight of care, of caring of life, of family, of land, of everything, right? And that role of caring as a domestic worker, sometimes for other families, even having to leave our families. And of course, as Angela Davis, as Maria del Pilar Hurtado, who was murdered in front of her son in 2019, as Francisca Cordova, as Cristina Bautista, an Indigenous woman who was murdered. It's women who are really rooted in the land. It's women who have ancestral knowledge, who have a vision that is an ancestral vision of freedom, of the need to care ourselves as humanity. And I think that's the legacy from that motherly love, that maternal love that we are always bringing in the function of policy. When from the women of the Toma to go face the politics of death in the state is a huge challenge, right? We have always been on the front line of facing death, of challenging death, of taking care of life, of resistance. We have resisted also all the ways of oppression, but also with the hope. When we talk about Colombia, this country would be a lot worse than it is if women in general, but in particularly Black women, had not done their role of care. Many of them without knowing how to read or write, but they have had values about life that now have been fractured in our country, because right now life doesn't matter. And those women have put that care and knowledge about life, had helped sustain life, and have made consciousness and build consciousness about the importance of care. They have reproduced the ancestral knowledge of traditional medicine, of food, care, as a part of strengthening the autonomy and self-determination of our peoples, of knowledge that right now had not been appreciated, right? Because of the hegemonic knowledge. And now we recognize the obligation to recognize them and strengthen those traditional knowledge, to have something that can strengthen our life, an alternative for that development of death that is being imposed over life, that impositions of white supremacy comes from there, right? White men who have privilege, who impose themselves when they tell us we need to leave our land. Who tells us that? Is a white man who considers we do not have rights because we are the descendants of men and women who were enslaved, who they think don't have any rights. So they feel like they have the rights to poison our rivers, to destroy our lands, to destroy the communities that we have built for years. There was a strike, a national strike in this country, in this city particular. The expressions that the government did against the strike in a city like Cali, that is in Latin America the second with the highest Black population. The way that social protest was given, the way that that protest was dealt with in this racialized community, was one of war. It was, we saw images of men who had braids, and they had literally opened their, like we could see their bones, their skull, because of the way that their skin had been lifted, and the way they would say that, kind of challenging our dignity, saying what is here is criminals, what we see here is hoodlums. And so many people were murdered in this city, and most of them were Black youth in racialized territories. But women were there with those youth, giving them strength with the community pot of cooking, and giving breakfast, giving food, and accompanying these youth every day. We're here for you. So the movement of women, of the struggles of Black women, of indigenous women, of peasant women, of working class sectors, have been so important in supporting the challenges that the Colombian youth are stepping up and facing, and building the links and the connections that of the traditional knowledge, as well as creativity and joy and poetry. And so right now there's a lot of hope of change, thanks to these struggles of these connections that are between different peoples, between women and youth. And that, I think, that's where the possibility for a true change exists.
Thank you, Francia. And to you, Angela, I return the same question. What is the role of Black women in this new moment of global politics marked by protests and political instabilities?
Well, first of all, thank you, Francia, for the beautiful answer to that question. And I guess I join you in recognizing that Black women have always been in the forefront of struggles for freedom, for equality, for justice, for life. And it's only very recently that we have begun to acknowledge the pivotal role that Black women have played throughout history, throughout the US, the Caribbean, and South America. And I would really like to thank all of the young scholars, scholar activists who are doing this work of attempting to retell the stories of our struggles for freedom. What's different about this era is that finally, after decades and centuries, Black women are being acknowledged. Not nearly as much as they should be, but the process has begun. And of course, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US has played a central role in insisting that Black women be recognized as leaders of struggle, and that leadership be rethought, that leadership does not have to be individualistic and masculinist, that it can be feminist, and it can be it can be collective, as opposed to focusing on a single charismatic Black male figure. So we really thank the Black Lives Matter movement for having brought us to this moment. And I'm remembering, Franzia, when we had that conversation with Alicia and Patrice early on about the ways in which people here, Black people affiliated with Black Lives Matter in this country, could directly participate in generating solidarity for the struggles in Colombia. But of course, it's so important for those of us in the US to recognize that we can draw inspiration from struggles that are unfolding in Latin America, Brazil. The assassination of Marielle Franco was not simply the assassination of an individual, but it was designed, it seems to me, to let Black women know that they were being recognized as the purveyors of a new kind of approach to struggle. And of course, Marielle Franco, in doing the work that she did in her community against police violence, against militarism, against homophobia, bringing it all together. She stands as an inspiration to all of us all over the world. And of course, you mentioned also the assassination of Berto Cáceres. I'm thinking about women who have emerged in, say, someone like Assata Traore in Paris, who is the key leader of the struggle against racist police violence in France. So one of the points that is always made is that when Black women rise up, the world rises with them. Black women, we have always fought for everyone else. And so if you are concerned that Black women will only represent themselves, all you have to do is look at history, and you can see that Black women have always represented the entire community. So what is wonderful about this moment is that the recognition of Black women's leadership points to a historical direction that can perhaps save us all, as Francia so eloquently put it. But But of course, we can't assume that every single Black woman, simply because she's Black and a woman, is going to represent radical and progressive views. And I know that people were, very excited about the election of Kamala Harris as vice president of the U.S. And let me say, of course, when someone like Barack Obama is elected president, it's a historical phenomenon. We embrace it. But at the same time, one has to look at the politics and ask, whether or not Barack Obama, during the time he was in the presidency, most effectively represented the needs of poor people and people of color and women and trans people, et cetera. Kamala Harris, one has to ask the same questions. And I do not believe change happens simply because someone who is affiliated with an oppressed racial group finally emerges as a leader. What I can say, and this is, I think this is most important, if we do what we did not do during the Obama administration, that is to say, put pressure on and challenge the Biden-Harris administration and force them to begin to move in a progressive direction, that is where hope resides. And I'll say to conclude that hope has to be generated. Hope isn't given to us automatically. I like what Maria Makava says about hope being a discipline, that we have to produce hope and generate hope. And this is precisely what Francia Márquez, Mina, is doing with her candidacy for the presidency of Colombia. And in that sense, this is a new era. But that era is an era in which the possibilities of struggle are becoming broader and more effective. But without mass struggle, we won't achieve anything.
Thank you, Angela. You connected very well to my next question. As you know, I think it's very important, as you said, that we're finally in an era where we're recognizing both historically and currently the central role that Black women have in producing change. And so the question I had next was about how do we understand Harris, right, as a first Black woman vice president in the White House of the U.S. In light of our conversation about Black women as a center for change. So you've already answered that part. So I would pose the question, invite Francia to comment, especially in light of her candidacy for presidency and the differences that we certainly know will be between a Harris and a Márquez administration. So Francia, would you like to comment, right, on the role of Harris as a first Black woman president in the U.S. and how you understand that in light of our conversation about Black women and their role in social change?
Well, the first thing I have to say is that I dream on the day that Black women don't have to be the first, but that there will be so many Black women in so many different role spaces to put each role to the service of life. I remember a few years ago that I was speaking to Angela Davis about presidency. I had said, if 100 years back, if the struggle of our people, of the ancestors for civil rights to eradicate racism, for justice, if Without that, Barack Obama would not have been a president, even though he currently does not represent the struggle of Black peoples and Black communities. But Barack Obama is a Black man in White House, but there are millions of Black men really rotten in the prisons, and the people who really suffered the most the consequences of Plan Colombia were Black people in the land. Those who were displaced in the community were as a result of the implementation of the drug policies that were pushed forward by Barack Obama. That politics that is anti-drug policies is the consequence of that is what we live in our land, because it's the way that the drug policies has not been effective. What it has led to has been death in our land and money to those who already have some. I sent a letter to Barack Obama, uh, Kamala Harris, when she went into that role, because when a Black girl sees someone like Kamala Harris in that role, she thinks maybe if she can, then I can too. It's a message of being able to build from the system that always tells us that we cannot do it, that we're not able, because that's what I'm living right now, right? People who say this is not my place, that I have no role in taking up a presidential candidacy, that I should just wait, even though we've been fighting for living in peace all of our life. But they tell me this is not the moment, wait for your time. And I answer, until when? And in that letter I said, okay, I celebrate that you are the first Black woman in the United States. It's a historical role that is important for many women, but don't forget that your struggle is part uh, of the struggle that was done by Angela Davis, Asada, so many other women, Rosa Parks, etc., etc. So many women, not just in the United States, but all around the world, so that that could be possible. And I told her, you speak a lot about the morality of the United States, of recovering the morality of the United States. Recovering the morality of the United States involves um, making sure that peace is a reality. And so that peace is a reality, we need to push for legalization of drugs in Colombia, because people are being uh, dug and buried, because it's very, very hard. The conditions that people are facing, Black people, peasant people in the country are facing, is similar to slavery. People are being forced to grow drugs in their land, but also the state is just criminalizing people and putting people in prison, because because then within that chain of drugs, those that really face the most is the chain that is the most vulnerable, is the people who are cultivating and facing things, right? So I shared this with her in the letter, and I said, your first commitment to be able to recover the morality of the United States involves that we need to stop the war in this country, in Colombia, and all around the world. It involves not reproducing violence in the way you have all around the world. It also means dealing with the environment and dealing with these corporations that use violence and armed violence to take over our land. in communities. I sent her the letter, but she never responded. And I think she will never answer. And this is not just a message for Kamala, it's a message for the United States, for their people, for humanity. It's a challenge. This is the challenge we're facing. This is what I think as far as the arrival of Kamala Harris. We would want to say, as Angela says, just by the fact of her being Black and arriving into a space like this, we would hope that the life of Black people, of people who have been excluded and oppressed, would change. But what I feel, and that many times systems use people, capitalist systems use them, and they use them to oppress their own Black people. In as in slavery, Black people were used to whip their own Black people in the ways that their masters had told them. So the other thing is that for me, to occupy the state is not the end. The end is to bring dignity to life, is to care for life, is to have more just spaces. The end is to end the murder of the planet. Occupying the state is just a means for the struggles that we continue as a people, the struggles that are needed by humanity and by this planet.
Well, I'll say, Francia, when you are president, Kamala Harris will have to answer to you. Will have to answer your letter after all. So I just wanted to continue to talk about, I think we've touched on sort of this perspective that we have from within the US and outside the US about the role of a Black person, right? Whether it's Obama and in this case Harris occupying the most powerful position really of leadership on this planet. And so I wanted to ask about, you know, continuing on this topic of internationalism and how to think across borders. How do you both see, and I can ask, and we can start with Angela, so Francia, you get a little bit of a break, but how do you both see the limits and possibilities for solidarity between left anti-racist movements in the United States, in Colombia, and the Americas more generally? And I know that your own personal experience with one another already speaks to that. But both, you know, what have been the limitations and what are other possibilities that you see emerging out of this moment in terms of solidarity across borders, particularly with the US and Colombia? Angela.
Well, solidarity is absolutely essential. I don't think we can accomplish anything really that will move us in a progressive direction without, and I'll use the old term, international solidarity. And I, you know, it seems as if it's more difficult today to generate solidarity when we have the technological means of communicating instantaneously with people across national borders, more difficult than it was, say, 50 years ago. You know, and I'm thinking about the fact that we that we will observe the 50th anniversary of the Attica uprising. As a matter of fact, on September 13th, the 9th through the 13th. And I'm thinking about the ways in which solidarity was expressed by people, you know, all over the world, literally all over the planet. And, you know, I'm remembering when the Black Panther Party was founded in 1968, and then, you know, almost immediately, Black Panther organizations were created in Brazil, in New Zealand, in Palestine, literally all over the world. And and of course, Francia spoke about the fact that when we first met, and we had this discussion about solidarity, I pointed out, and I constantly make this point, that I would not be here today if not for the international solidarity that was generated around the demand for my freedom. I will never forget that. But of course, that was a period when that solidarity was produced through, basically through snail mail. Because we weren't even allowed to, it was very expensive to make long distance phone calls. So we didn't even use telephones, we wrote letters. And this is how we built movements around the Puerto Rican nationalists, movements to free Mandela, the campaign around Márquez, the struggle to free the Soledad brothers. And I have many, many stories to tell about the impact of that solidarity. Today, we are speaking across thousands and thousands of miles of distance. And so technologically, we have the capacity to generate the kind of solidarity that we need to offer to Francia, for example, in her campaign for the presidency of Colombia. Solidarity in struggles against the extension of the global prison industrial complex, and in places like Colombia and Brazil and throughout the world. And so I think that this is a challenge. This is a challenge of this era, that we have to devote more attention to developing relationships across national borders. And let me just say that abolition calls upon us to use a kind of imagination that is not promoted by capitalists and governments, the kind of imagination that calls upon us to envision the future differently, a future without the global impact of a handful of capitalists, male capitalists, who have accumulated more wealth than poor people on this planet. So I suppose I would say that our conversations about solidarity should be about challenges. And we should remember, as we engage in these activities of the imagination, that ultimately we want a planet that is not divided by national borders. Let's remember that the nation state is a product of capitalism. And we should not have to remain content with this particular form of organizing human community, because it represents a particular moment in history. It represents a moment of the ascendance of the bourgeoisie, of capitalism. So I would like us to stretch our collective imagination to envision a time in the future, whether any of us are around to witness it or not, where we don't have to depend on the production of papers, citizenship papers, to move from one place to another, where citizenship is imagined as global citizenship. And And it's not only about humanity, but it's about the other animals and the plants with whom we share this planet. So this is it's a kind of abolitionist imagination that allows us to plot out a strategy for the present that must indeed involve efforts to transgress these national boundaries and to express solidarity with those who are fighting for a better future.
I just wanted to do the little snaps when you said abolish the nation state. I was just like, yes. I wanted to invite you, Francia, to engage this question. How do you see the limits and possibilities for solidarity between left anti-racist movements in the United States, Colombia, the Americas, and more globally?
Bueno, yo creo que
Well, I think that solidarity has to go through a collective, extensive vision where we see each other as family, where we see each other as a peoples, as communities, linking struggles and recognizing our common vision to build without the need to exterminate one another physically, morally, spiritually. And as Angela Davis said, I think we have everything we need. Before we had less and we did more, now we have more and we do less. We have the possibility to connect virtually and speak across distances. Before, you had to travel to different places to make connections. I think that we have fallen victim to this system that has turned us into individuals, that has in some way mutilated our inspiration for change, right? So we are not, because of the global market, we have internalized this system where we are not able to imagine a different world. And that is the greatest challenge we face. And I think that those principles around collectivity and to think about land collectively and not individualistically, to share food, right? Something that we have done for so long in our communities, in cities. We should give another meaning to urban spaces, no longer where each person figures things out on their own, where we don't care about each other. And I think we carry this Ubuntu philosophy, which invites us to think about the other, to think about nature, to think of ourselves as part of nature and not the owners of nature. And I think those are fundamental, basic principles that will lead to change and to transform this death policy towards a policy that centers life, that considers distributing and not accumulating at the hands of a small minority. I think all of that would be helpful because the system has it all. They have used it all in coordination, all their strategies, they're all linked. Our actions tend to be individual. Our actions are about bringing on visibility and fighting for that individual visibility, while the system works collectively at the same time as they have the prison system. They're carrying out an armed conflict, violence at the same time, evictions, unjust laws. It has it all to subjugate us. So I think we need to make resistance global. We need to make solidarity global in the same way that these people have done a good job for over 500 years of capitalism, enslavement, and colonization. They have done a good job, and it has worked for them, and they have making us apart, and it is now our turn to do our task, to carry out our task. And this concept around solidarity has also been co-opted by the system, because now when people think about international solidarity, they think about international cooperation. But for our people, even in our own movements, we cannot survive off cooperation. Where does that cooperation comes from? Where that economic cooperation comes from multinational corporations that created these hardships. And at the same time, we see these companies providing for indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples in Colombia. They do workshops and events where women take the time to go to these workshops so they can take pictures of them, where they can sign in. But that does not change the structural lives of people. This is the kind of cooperation that makes us dependent of that and does not allow us to act as a people with autonomous resistance, with autonomy, and it takes away from that. And I think those are some of the challenges that we're facing. And I think we see that everywhere economically, with environment, in how we live, in how we relate to each other, in how we consume, right? In what we eat, right? So I think we should start there, and we should think about this extensive family that we have, ready to make a change and ready to put life at the center.
Thank you, Francia, for your remarks. And I think it connects very well to the question that I have for you that will help us, continue to understand the way that you're framing your campaign, right? That you talk about the politics of life, and that you're part of this movement. I am because we are Ubuntu. And if you could talk to us a little bit more about the movement, about your campaign, because I also want to talk about an ask that we have of the Colombian public to support Francia and accumulating 1 million signatures by the end of November in order to secure her position in the primaries for the presidency. So if you could take the time, Francia, to talk to us a little bit more about the movement and the campaign.
Sí, bueno,
Yeah.
Como decía, yo veo esta campaña.
Well, as I was saying, I see this campaign as, I don't see it as an end, I see it as a means, right? And as a way to plant a seed of hope, because in this country, people cannot go on like this. People are tired, they're hopeless, people are just living, surviving because they're like the living dead, because there's not an expectation of change, because they're going hungry, because their basic rights are not protected, education, food, running water. And with the pandemic, some people are saying that the pandemic created this crisis, but the pandemic really unveiled the true crisis so that we can now see it very clearly. And in the middle of this, the social movements happening is a sign that things need to change in the country, and change will not come from white supremacy, from the elite or privileged men who have governed us in the 200 plus years of the nation state as a republic. And of course, this government has been built from a racialized patriarchal system. And this will not change if the people at the bottom, from below, from our land and territories, create and push for this change. A change in patriarchy will not happen if we as women and human beings do not come together to transform that. And racism will also not change if we first don't recognize the systemic structural oppression that we need to confront. And we also need to consider historical reparations in this country in regards to the effects of colonialism, racism, patriarchy that keeps damaging our lives, keeps damaging Mother Earth and our human life. So we are pushing for this. Those of us from the grassroots, as Angela Davis said, if Black women improve their living conditions, the society as a whole will improve their living conditions. If we create justice, push for justice for those who are most oppressed, this society will make progress in regards to justice as a whole. And this is what we want. This is what we want to do as a campaign. Even if we don't win, we want to advance the dialogue around democracy and justice, which democracy that doesn't mean anything to us. Rich white men talk about democracy all day long. But what does that mean to a woman that works as a domestic worker at 6 a.m. and gets home at 10 p.m.? And when she goes back to Agua Blanca in Cali, she realizes that her children have been murdered, that her children don't have food, they don't have the option of going to school, of going to university, they don't have access to food or anything. What does that mean to that woman? What does that mean to those communities that don't have a dignified living, that every day are being displaced, that are pushed to live in the city, and they get murdered in the city? As that's what happened during the strike. A lot of the men who were murdered who came from the Colombian Pacific region. Some were looking for employment opportunities, some were fleeing violence, and they came into a city that didn't recognize them as their own and that allowed them to be killed, to be disappeared, for their rights to be violated. And that's why we're doing this. We want this country to think collectively, to realize that there's a big need for a change, to halt this death policy, and to change those death policies, to put an end to war, to close inequality gaps, social inequity that will allow us to make progress in terms of racial justice, gender justice. That will not happen from the top down. That has to come from the bottom up, from the root. And that is what motivates us to keep on going, to know that we can create change. And of course, for me, this means to subjugate ourselves to a number of different kinds of violence, because this state does not know how to act without violence. It has always had to use violence in order to work. The Colombian state does not work without violence. It uses fear, displacement, hunger, misery, expropriation, and death to maintain itself. It uses armed conflict to then sell you safety for the people in order to kill people. That's how the state has worked. And despite it all, we are here in the way that Black women do, that we put our bodies in the line to stop illegal mining. We put our bodies in the line, as many young people do in many cities, to face this warlike policy that the state has against civil society. This is what we're doing with me with my candidacy, and we hope to give a deeper sense to democracy as a means to change. And for me, it means bringing together the historical struggles of indigenous, Black, peasant farmer, women, struggles, the LGBT community, as well as peoples who have been oppressed. It also means hope, right? It's the time has come to overcome our fear and to create solidarity across peoples. And we also do this with a lot of joy. It has been quite impressive to see so many young people joining us, saying they're going out to the streets to collect signatures, they're making posters. They don't have a lot, but they give whatever they have to continue. And I think that's the essence of change, to give whatever little we have to create change.
Thank you so much, Francia. And before we conclude, I want to again invite the Colombian citizenry, the Colombian public, to support Francia Márquez Mina's presidency by making sure to sign the petition that will allow her to make it to the primaries. She's running without a political party as an independent, so this is very important for her to acquire 1 million signatures before the end of November. And she will also have a Vaki fundraising account, again, because she's doing this without the support of corporations, right? And this is a people's movement that is supporting this candidate. So we invite the Colombian public to support Francia Márquez Mina's presidency. And I invite my panelists, if you have any last comments you'd like to share with one another and with your public before we close out. It was a pleasure being part of this conversation with the two of you. I hope we will do this in person very soon. And so please, couple of last remarks before we close out.
Well, I would like to say that I've gotten several texts in the course of this conversation from people who are watching, and they want to know what people in the US and other countries can do to support Francia's candidacy. So perhaps she can tell us how those of us who are not Colombian citizens can continue to support her during this period.
Well, first of all, since the election is not happening soon, I cannot say much about what to say, what to do. I think we should create people's mandates that can turn into policies. So we want the support of scholars and many people who have worked around racial issues, environmental issues, environmental justice, climate change, and the economy, right? Because one of the challenges that we're seeing in regards to the climate struggle is the argument from a lot of elected officials that reproduce the enslavement system, the patriarchal system, the economic system, and capitalism, is that they say that they cannot transition from extractivist economy to fossil energy to think about clean green energy, because that would mean creating a crisis, a profound crisis for the state. However, the state is already in crisis. So in that sense, we would like to think about a pro-life economy that centers gender, racial, environmental justice, that takes into consideration the social well-being, welfare of the whole of humanity and all the people of Colombia. There are some of the challenges that we're facing. And of course, we're also wondering what anti-patriarchal justice means as part of a governmental program. That's where we want to build. We want to propose, to have proposals that come from the bottom, from the grassroots. There are people who tell me that I don't have a lot of experience in government, that therefore I should not be running and I should not aspire to become president. But what I say to them is, I might not have experience as part of this death policy politics in the face of corruption, but I do have experience in regards to care that we should put into effect to center life. Doing all this is a challenge, which means to deconstruct the ways that politics have been done historically, not only in this country, but around the world. So we want people to help us think through this, to share their knowledge, their heart, their experiences, to support this political processes, because we want to think about this collectively and we will keep pushing forward. And there's an effort going on right now to silence our voices. The polls, they don't include us because they don't want the public to know that there's a Black woman running for president, that there are Indigenous women running for president, that there are alternative sectors that are putting forth a new platform for a new nation. And what they do is, those of us who are more visible, they stigmatize them. And of those of us who are not visible in the rest of the country, they erase us. So I think that international press is very effective to give voice, to help us bring visibility inside this country and beyond this new platform that's looking for change from the grassroots, from a place of collectivity of the people. A collective governance is what we're thinking about. This is what we want to propose, not only in Colombia, not only in America, but in the whole world. A feminist governance, an anti-patriarchal governance. Those are the things that I can say. I'm sure there's many other things that we would like to do, but when it comes to politics, there's some electoral rules we cannot violate, but for now, the first step is to collect signatures so that we can be part of the historical pact where there's other candidates, and the candidate that gets the most votes will be the person who will be running on the presidential ticket against those in the ultra-right and also the centrists, those who have been promoting a politics of death and exclusion. I'm very happy for this space and for being able to see Angela Davis, to meet again and to be able to gain and hear from your knowledge and experiences. And we keep building as sisters, as compañeras, among women, among men, as a community. It always brings me joy, this in the middle of so many sad things, and just to be in spaces like this, to listen to women like Angela Davis, it gives me more hope. It just fills me with joy. And thank you, Angela, and thank you, Mamira. I know that Mamira is a Haitian woman. She is of Haitian descent, and we have seen each other as sisters. And to say that what is happening in Haiti hurts us, because we know that Haiti helped liberate La America that is ungrateful, that turns its back on its people, and that condemned them to death, and that Haiti is still paying the audacity to liberate the whole of Latin America. So I want to express my solidarity with the Haitian people. Unfortunately, those who export violence, who brought upon violence in Haiti were people who came from my country. And I am ashamed to know that it's people that came from this land that went over there to reproduce the same kind of violence that they have carried out among us here, Colombians, and they do it now internationally against the Haitian people. But we're still here resisting, and I hope that this political project that we're carrying out allows us to continue with fighting for equality, justice, and especially for peace in the world and with Mother Nature.
Thank you, Francia. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, the People's Forum, the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. This has been a wonderful event, wonderful conversation. I hope we will have another. That's it. We didn't get a chance to hear from the audience, but I think our questions covered everything that we hope to discuss today. And have a good evening, have a good night. And we continue to support you, Francia, in all the ways we can from outside of Colombia. Thank you.